many investors are moving into questions about purpose. What is this all about? It may also relate to their personal lives, etc. And what do I want to achieve? And what do I want to achieve is again a very personal question. But often this will go into sustainability and climate change or leading change in our case. So my name is Philipp Cottier. I'm based in Zurich, Switzerland. I do a number of different things, and I'm heavily engaged in impact investments in general. I represent a couple of organizations. One is our own family foundation called Cottier Donzé Foundation, where we support a lot of girl empowerment projects in Africa and in Nepal. And all the assets of which, so the assets of this foundation, actually invested in an impact manner or way. I'm also involved in a company called Persistent Energy. They are venture builders, so they build solar home systems and solar off-grid companies across sub-Saharan Africa. Plus in a couple of other impact ventures and companies like ResponsAbility, etc. It depends very much which sector you're talking about. I find it quite easy to measure impact when it's renewable energy related, because you can translate more or less everything into CO2 savings and similar. It becomes much more complicated when you look at financial inclusion or sustainable agriculture or other fields. And then if you want to aggregate different sectors, it becomes even more complex. So the different companies I work with, they all employ their own impact measurement systems to various degrees. I think on the investment side, you can sort of measure, all the way up to all these different outputs, etc. Outputs are somewhat easy to measure. If you didn't really go into social impact and other types of impact, it becomes much more complex. In our foundation, it's even more difficult because it's about empowering girls. So how do you measure empowerment, which is a multi-year process, right? So it's not something you can do overnight, and it's not so easy to measure outputs. So a lot of it you simply have to believe. But of course, we do measure simple measures like how many girls are impact or go through the program, what they learn. So we do checks and questionnaires and all that. But so far, we have not engaged in any, let's say, long-term measurements over 10 or 20 years to measure how these girls are doing, simply also because it's very difficult to establish a baseline to compare with. So on the asset side, all these different investments we have, for instance, in the foundation, we rely very much on the measurements we get from the different companies we work with, or we invest in, or we invest through. They don't always add up because they use different measurement systems. And again, you can't easily add up the different sectors because they may not have any meaningful common denominators. How do you add up financial inclusion and sustainable agriculture and renewable energy and education and healthcare? It's not easy. But we rely on these measures, and most of the cases we find their impact reports very useful. Again, it's more about outputs than actual impact, which is more complex to measure. But it's okay. Now moving to the liability side, so the grants that we provide to these different projects we have in places like Kenya or Nepal. That's a little bit more complicated because in most cases these are local NGOs or quite small structures. So we try to do some of the measurements, which in some case we have to implement ourselves, but we don't want to overload them with bureaucratic or admin burdens, because they should really get maximum horsepower and leverage onto the ground without being distracted by too many things. So again, here it's more about outputs and questionnaires that we measure. We often find that the bigger NGOs, some of them have really good ways to think about measuring impact and outputs. And so we instead of trying to reinvent the wheel or so, we will try to put our local NGOs in contact with these bigger, let's say more international NGOs who already have programs that are working that can be measured, etc. Put them in link, and then see if we can implement some of that in our smaller structures. That works quite well. In some of the really small projects, however, it's really down to output measurement. Give an example. We have a female car mechanics program in a slum in Nairobi. There's lots of slums in Nairobi, but this is one that is neglected by most NGOs. So there's not a lot of NGO activity there in the eastern suburbs, Mathare. And these girls, they do a 2-year auto mechanic training, which we pre-fund, and the girls then have to pay back from their first salary. They sort of pay back 25%, or they commit to pay back using 25% of their salary until they've paid back their sort of the school money, or the education loan money, or vocational training loan money, if you like. So things that we measure here are how many girls went through the course each year. How many of them found a job? So far, it's been 100%, so that was easy. What salary do they earn? And turns out that for instance, in this one, they earn between $300 and $800 a month, which is huge, given that the teachers in that same slum earn between $80 and $120. You know, so that's a very good measure. So it's pretty easy. It's successful, and we see it also when we visit them on the ground, and we see these girls. They come with their overalls, car mechanic overalls, and they're really strong, and they're fully empowered. They're rock stars in their own slum, because they earn a lot of money, and and they can fight the boys. It's somewhat easy to measure, right? Because it's immediate success, economic success, standing in society, etc. Other programs we have are much more difficult. We have some against sexual violence. We have some against early pregnancies, etc. But often there's sort of girl empowerment programs that do 1 session per week with the girls of specific age in some schools. And here, basically, what we measure is just how many girls attended this course, and we compare the questionnaires in the beginning and at the end. So it's very simple.